Welcome to Reaction with me, Iain Martin. I'm editor of Reaction, and I'm joined by my colleague, Maggie Pagano, executive editor of Reaction. And what a day it's been. Westminster. Obviously, the big story is Dominic Cummings. Dominic Cummings gave evidence to a joint committee of House of Commons Select Committees, chaired by Jeremy Hunt, the former Health Secretary, and by Greg Clark, former Cabinet Minister. And it was quite spectacular, Maggie. I watched most of it. I also had to write my column for the Times, which is not on this subject, on something else entirely. But I think I got most of it and saw, I think, the key parts. I was very impressed by the evidence given. I'll explain why I thought it was significant. But Maggie, what did you make of it?
Well, number one, Iain, it was just exhausting. I mean, Cummings spoke basically for 7 hours with some really good questions, actually. I think there are lots of different parts to it, aren't there? One, what was impressive, I don't know if it's the same reason that you think so, was that he took blame too for basically what he saw was a shambles within both civil service, the cabinet, and even the top of the NHS, maybe less so. But what I felt slightly uncomfortable with, and you probably disagree with me, is that he took the axe. I mean, it really was a scene from Chainsaw Massacre to Matt Hancock and others within the cabinet. It's interesting, he didn't mention Michael Gove by name, but he kept mentioning the cabinet secretary.
And of course, Michael Gove is his great friend in politics and was his promoter and worked with him at Department of Education.
Yeah, who he's fallen in and out with, but now supposedly back with. So he took blame, but I don't know whether it was necessary. I feel quite confused, actually, because one, what we saw today was just a brilliant example of the way that fundamentally British democracy is pretty open. We are transparent. We had somebody who's able to basically call the Prime Minister a fool, not capable, to call the Health Secretary a liar. I mean, can you imagine any other country in Europe doing this? So I think that in one sense. Then there's part of me that says, well, actually, should some of this have been behind closed doors? And did he need to be quite so vindictive? What we wanted to hear is that those two, well, from end of January, end of March, the thinking that went on. And I was very struck by some of the people that he called upon during that time that perhaps we haven't heard much about, like the Google DeepMind chap, Demis Hassabis, how they were, drawing on expertise. But anyway, Iain, you tell me why you thought it was impressive.
Well, I think that he essentially did his country a great service today. And I'm someone who has tangled at various points down the years with Dominic Cummings. I'm well aware of his shortcomings, and he can be a very frustrating person for those who have to deal with him. And I've long thought that a big part of his problem has been a tendency to regard everyone else as an idiot. I mean, he did praise a lot of people in passing, junior officials and people from the private sector. So it was more nuanced than that today. But he has had a tendency down the years, a tendency towards impossibilism and setting standards that are too high and being too relentlessly critical. So having said all that, I've written a lot down the years that's critical of Dominic Cummings and his approach. But I think, as you say, Maggie, it's not just that you had the transparency, which I think is positive. And I was fascinated by the way in which some people didn't necessarily want the transparency. And there's a lot of commentary in the run up to it saying, is anyone really interested? Does anyone really care about this? It was all a year ago. Shouldn't we just forget about it, move on? Fascinatingly, a lot of the people who were saying on Twitter that we shouldn't really care about it, nonetheless seemed to care about it enough to watch it and to comment on it as it went. But I thought he laid out the evidence and laid out the charges and the critique of what went wrong with the British state catastrophically at a crucial moment. I thought he laid it out very calmly, impressively. Some of the charges he will have to back up with evidence, as Greg Clark and Jeremy Hunt made clear that he was making charges in particular about Matt Hancock, the health secretary, which there's going to have to be some, some further evidence supplied, and Hancock denies it all. But I think as an exercise in a first draft or second draft of history, trying to get to the heart of what went wrong and why the system wasn't properly prepared, and that's not just about Boris Johnson, that is dating back over 10 years of pandemic planning, and why the machine then didn't respond in the way that it did, I thought was highly impressive, a real service to history and a service to his country. I mean, the critics will say, and I think it's a perfectly valid criticism, look, the state of things that she maps out, which is appalling, required a Margaret Thatcher or a Winston Churchill or Gordon Brown, arguably, style person to respond differently in January and February before the disaster. And that's not Boris Johnson. Those are not his strengths. He's a front man, a showman. And who put Boris Johnson there? Now, Boris Johnson, keeps standing and keeps winning election, but Dominic Cummings, takes a large part of the credit for having made Boris Johnson Prime Minister. And can he really be surprised that Boris was not someone brilliant on the detail and across all the science, with a gift for grilling the experts and getting the right, the right policy in place? Do you see what I'm getting at, Maggie? That it's partly his creation.
Responsibility, indeed. I thought, in some ways, he didn't critique Boris too much on that, did he? He accepted that these were extraordinary circumstances. Really, that last 2 weeks of should there have been a lockdown or not. What I thought was the elephant in the room, actually, during that question is nobody asked him why they hadn't called in the military in earlier on. Because if you go back to the planning, which is what he says, that Plan A was really not up to scratch, and you had to go quickly to Plan B, and that there was no one there capable of pulling all the strings together. He even mentioned the word, he didn't say we needed a dictator, but he used the word dictator. So I'm wondering, because Nick Carter was brought in early on and then sort of disappeared, but I find that interesting because he talked about, and he had written about in his blogs, pandemic planning, solar flares, and all these missing bits in the plan. So surely when you're up to a crisis of logistics, they should have brought in certainly army people advising them. Maybe they were. We didn't hear that today at all, did we? I thought that was really fascinating.
That was odd. And previous prime ministers, I'm sure that will be addressed with other witnesses, and then also when it comes to the full public inquiry, which this is not. There's the later full statutory thing. That it's clear that several former prime ministers did pass on that message to the prime minister, that he needed to get the army in and give the army maximum responsibility as early as possible, because logistics is it's what the army, what the MOD does, and that didn't happen for reasons which have not been adequately explained. I mean, I think the other takeaway for me on it, it was just a reminder that this thing is going to have a very long tail. We're going to be dealing with the legal consequences of what happened in that catastrophic period for many years to come. And one of the things that's baffled me a bit about the government's response has been that the government has a perfectly plausible explanation. It is horrifying what happened in Britain in the first few months of that year. I thought that they would certainly, I just assumed that they knew what they were doing, that the scientists knew what they were doing, and that that there was a plan. It turns out that there wasn't. But that if the government could say, well, look, mistakes were made, it was unprecedented, as people realized as we went along through this process as a country, we realized that mistakes were being made, and we adapted and then made better choices later on, though not necessarily, maybe that isn't the case in terms of last winter, but certainly is the case in terms of the vaccine. I think the punters, the public, are in a mood to be understanding about that. Instead, the government clings to the idea that everything was kind of okay, everyone was working hard from the start. That's clearly not the case, because Cummings has mapped out a trail of disaster, missed opportunities, poor structures, lack of process, lack of proper engagement by the Prime Minister. That's fairly devastating. However, maybe the reason, I don't know if you agree, Maggie, maybe the reason that they're not doing that is because they're worried about legal culpability, and that I think is my big takeaway from the day, is that there are clearly going to be legal cases and things spilling out of the public inquiry where families, I would be astonished if people don't eventually get to a position where they seek compensation, if it is the case, denied by the Department of Health, that assurances were given on discharging patients from hospital into care homes, and that clearly happened without testing. Then you're into the realm, I think, don't you agree, of legal cases and compensation?
Absolutely, and potentially could go on for years and years. And I suppose that's what's so damaging about his, well, I don't know if we can call it evidence, his testimony.
Yeah.
The Prime Minister de facto is responsible for unnecessary deaths. That's really the kernel of what he said. Well, if that is true, then anybody during that period can make those claims. And I guess if you were in a care home, and all the care home workers, many of whom were very ill, and bus drivers and people, all the service people who got involved, you could argue, could take legal claims. Be devastating.
Yeah.
Corporate manslaughter, I don't know whether it can actually get to that stage, which is, perhaps you're right. That's why they're not responding yet. They need legal advice, potentially. I mean, the only point about the care homes is that the hospitals, of course, were the places where people were catching it perhaps quicker than anywhere else. So, but then you can never prove that, could you? You couldn't say, well, the care home was safer than the hospital.
Yeah. But there was this sense in the build up to it, and I think it says something really troubling about how politics is being conducted now and viewed. And I think it's a function of excessive concentration on opinion polling and measurement of public sentiment, which was that this Twitter thing, the defense of the government, which you saw was rooted in the idea that, well, the public doesn't really care. The public's moved on and it's all priced in, and it's Cummings just being bitter, and public trusts the government on this and is basically forgiving, which I think is a terrible way to think about what matters or what's important, as though there's just this constant running opinion poll. And the government's partly to blame for this, because it polls like mad and spends far too much money on polling. And polling can't give you foresight; it can give you insight or a snapshot and tell you about what people are thinking at any given moment. But they change their mind quite often within the course of a year. There's a public opinion is important, but it's not the sole test. Quite often, the public doesn't care about a particularly important story for a very long time, if ever. But it still matters. Absolutely. And also the public opinion test is, I mean, that Richard Nixon wins a landslide, wins 49 states in the 1972 US presidential election. And the public doesn't care at that point about Watergate or the problems in the Nixon White House. Well, look at what then happens within a couple of years, and the public cares a lot, and the president is gone. I'm not making a direct parallel between Watergate and what happened with COVID and the Johnson administration, just to make the point that politics can change and the public focus change. And there also, I think, there are things at play here that are not just about about measuring public opinion. And that's what I thought was so powerful about today, was that you had all the, from certain people, you had the kind of snark about trying to turn this into a kind of joke or a circus, or because it's Cummings annoys certain kinds of journalists. So they were, some people who shall remain nameless were really prepared to enjoy it and treat it almost as a kind of ultra cynical joke. Others said, well, the public doesn't really care. And in the end, I think you had something really, and I say this as someone who's criticized Cummings a lot in the past, you had something historically significant that taught us a lot about flaws in the British state, that if you're a taxpayer, a voter, and you care about your country in any way, I think it was a really chastening, difficult experience, difficult watch that raised a lot of valid questions.
I agree. He exposed our vulnerabilities and frailties within the back room, if you like, of the British state. That was the most, that was the greatest eye opener, wasn't it? And I think, going back to your previous point, I think that what it also it will undermine a lot of the trust that people have had in the government, and particularly with Boris. They sort of, despite all the sort of chaos around him, they said, well, he was handed a bad deal, and he handled it very well. And they might just start rethinking that now.
Yeah.
Actually, was he? And it might take time to unwind.
Yeah, we'll see. And then it's going to be really interesting tomorrow. Maybe we'll come back to this, but it's going to be fascinating to watch how it plays in terms of coverage tomorrow.
Particularly all those people who really disliked Cummings now, we're going to hail him as the hero, saintdom, isn't it?
Well, there is that irony, isn't there? People who were denouncing him as the devil all of last year now claiming that he's this great truth-telling whistleblower and hero. Of course, the truth is much more complex and more interesting than that, and somewhere in the middle. But we'll maybe return to all of that. But if you're not a Reaction subscriber, subscribe to us on our YouTube channel, but also become a Reaction subscriber, and you get my weekly newsletter, email newsletter. You get access to all the great stuff we do on the site, all the great journalism produced by the team, and Maggie's column, and our columnists like Tim Marshall. So subscribe to Reaction. But thank you for joining us.